Developers using Team Foundation Server have a very powerful way to take their changes that they're making but not ready to commit and store them on the server. Basically, if they go home and win the lottery and never come back to work or get hit by the apocryphal bus or whatnot, when that happens, their data is still stored. Or if they drop their machine or something crashes, it's still stored on the server. And it's called a shelf set. And in this demonstration, I want to walk through how to administer shelf sets. But the first thing that I think is important is that we create a shelf set that we can work with. So let's open Visual Studio and take a look at what a shelf set is so you have that basic understanding. Basically, I've got this form and it says say hi. And if I double click it, we've got some code behind it and there's this message box. And I may want to say something like, I might want to add a second message box. And again, very, very simple thing here. Hello world. And then I might want to say goodbye when I'm done saying hello. Now, again, trivial application, but I've made a change and I don't want to check this in yet. I only want to store it and maybe pass it around for review or those sorts of things. If I want to do that, I can right click our solution and I can shelve that as well. So creating a shelf set is what you do under source control, shelve pending changes, and it takes my changes and it puts them out on the server. Now, I have a lot of different options that I can do, like preserving the pending changes locally. We don't really care about those. Those are more developer-centric. But from an administration perspective, I'm going to call this shelf set say goodbye. You can add spaces in here. I'm not going to use any spaces. And I'm going to shelve that. And what that does is it puts it out on the server. And if I drop my laptop or whatnot, I could always get this information back. But that shelf set is now successfully created. Later on, if I'm working here, doing something and I could be editing these files or whatnot, and I could go back and I could go and unshelve that thing. I could find the shelf sets that I have and say goodbye. Notice I deleted it here. If I double click say goodbye, I can decide that I want to unshelve it. And when I unshelve it, it brings back those changes back to Visual Studio. So that shelf set there really helps me out. I have a conflict. I'm going to merge the changes. And I want this to be the accepted merge. Now we've gone maybe a little bit more in detail about what shelf sets are when we're really talking mostly about how to administer those shelf sets. Just make sure when we go back to Form 1 that we're back to that shelf set. But let's talk about administration. Now, if I want to deal with my own shelf sets, if you as an administrator are looking over someone's shoulder, you can go here and go into things like the Source Control Explorer or pending changes, and you can look at people's shelf sets just by hanging over their shoulder. They can go to Action and find their own shelf sets, and you don't have to just look at your own. I could enter somebody else's data here as well. Like I could go find Steve and find his. I don't have a user Steve with shelf sets, but if I did, I would see Steve's shelf sets here. So I can see shelf sets, I can look for other people's shelf sets, and then I can unshelve those into my local directory. Oh, and by the way, you can right-click things and you can delete these shelf sets right from here if you have the appropriate permission. So as an administrator, I can look for other people's shelf sets and delete them if I want, but I'm kind of doing it from within this Visual Studio context. I also want to show what I think might be a more elegant solution, and that's to go into the command window. You have a couple of commands, tf shelf sets, and we can look at what that does. That basically allows you to pass in some details, and it'll show you the shelf sets. So we can say tf shelf sets, leave it blank, and it's going to come back and it's going to show me mine. Say goodbye and trying this, my two shelf sets. I can pass in things like a whack owner and administrator, and that's again just me, but when you hit it, it'll give me back the administrator. So I need the unique one here. Owner is, there we go back, and I can see my shelf sets. So there's lots of things if you just want to type shelf sets that can return all of the shelf sets and search for them by owner. Other things we can do is there's a one called tf shelve. And I'm going to take a look at that one. Tf shelve is how you create a shelf set from the command line. not quite as interesting from an administration perspective, but it's also where we're going to delete shelf sets. So we can type tf shelf whack delete to delete a shelf set. Now we need to provide a shelf set name. I could do something like say goodbye. Are you sure we want to delete it? Yes or no? I'm going to push no for now. And because I want to also show that you can also use a semicolon and then the name of the owner of the shelf set, just in case more than one user has the same named shelf set. So often it's a good idea to do something like this. And then I can decide if I want to delete that shelf set. Now if we type tf shelf set again, or shelf sets, now we'll find that we only have that one remaining one, the trying this shelf set. So in this demonstration, we've done a couple things. We've shown off what a shelf set is, just so you have that idea when you're trying to administer a TFS server. And secondly, we've walked through how to manipulate those inside of Visual Studio. And lastly, we've walked through two commands that I think are very useful. tf shelf sets, which is used to display and show shelf sets across the collection or for an individual user. And we've also used tf shelf to delete a workspace.
Now that you've had a chance to learn about using content types, workflows, the calendar app, and Office applications from within SharePoint 2016, it's time to put your knowledge to the test. In this exercise, you'll start by adding the calendar app to your site and name the calendar Business Calendar. Then, using today's date, add a new event to your calendar. Enter Meeting in the title and put in a start time of 9 a.m. for a 30-minute duration, except all other default settings. Now, change that calendar scope so it displays the week. Open a document using the Word web application. And finally, edit a document using the Word web app and change the font size to a 14 point. Now I want you to pause this video to complete the exercise, and once you've finished, you can unpause the video to see how I did this exercise. Welcome back. Now let's take a look at how I tackled this exercise, and keep in mind that you may not have done it in exactly the same way that I do it here. Okay, the first thing we need to do was add the calendar app to our site and name the calendar Business Calendar. So I'm going to go to my site contents, choose Add an App, and we need to find our calendar. There it is. And we need to name this Business Calendar. There we go. And we can click Create. Now, using today's date and a new event in the calendar, we need to enter the new event as meeting. So let's go into our Business Calendar. We'll use today's date, and I'm going to click on Add. We need to enter Meeting as the title, and start time is going to be 9 a.m. It's going to be a half-hour long. So let's set this to 9 a.m. to 9:30. And we need to leave everything else the same and save that. Now we need to change the calendar scope to display the week. Well, in order to do that, we need to mouse up to our ribbon, click on our calendar tab, change it to the 1 week scope. Now open a document using the Word web application. All right, to do that, I'm going to go back to my Brextil home, click on my documents, and I'm going to open up my employee evaluations document in the Word web app. That's done. And the final task is to edit a document using the Word web app and change the font size to 14. So we need to edit this document in our web application. Here we go. And I'm actually going to highlight all this text and change the font size to 14. There we go. That was the last task in the exercise. Now that's how I would have tackled this exercise. Did you do it in the same way?
Now that we've installed the proxy server and we've seen how we can do things like change the file cache folder from here, let's take a look at some more advanced uses of the proxy server. And to do that, we need to go into the proxy configuration file itself. Now, the proxy configuration file is generally located, if you've done a default installation, of C:\program files, Team Foundation Server 12, version control proxy. And once you get in here, we need to drive into a little bit more detail. TFS data is where the data will be held, but we want to go into web services. From there, go again into the version control proxy, and we'll see a proxy.configuration file. We can go ahead and edit that proxy.configuration file in something like Notepad, and in here we're going to see a lot of different elements and items that we can use to make changes. So let's take a look at what some of those are. The first node to pay attention to is this servers node. Inside of the servers node, here we're identifying a single server. If we want to add more servers, we can certainly do so. In that case, all we have to do is make a copy of this server element and change it to point to another location. We may have a secondary server at secondary TFS server, :8080, whack TFS, whack NWC, or some other TPC, some pointing to some other team project collection. That's how you would add another server. In fact, you can add multiple servers to this. Another thing is the location of the cache root folder. And the cache root folder is right here. Now, it's recommended in 2013 that you don't make changes here, but instead use the UI. However, you could also make changes here and it won't really hurt anything. Now in 2012, this is where you need to make those changes. Now, the next thing is to look at the cache limit policy. How much cache do we want to keep on this system? And we've got two different ways we can limit the cache. We can limit the cache as a percentage of disk space, and this is the default, and it defaults to 75% of the entire size of the hard drive. This may or may not be appropriate. You could, if you preferred, use a fixed sized base policy to limit it to 200 gigabytes, for instance, or 15 gigabytes if you wanted to. Next thing is the deletion age threshold. How long should things just hang out in the cache without really being accessed following a cleanup operation? And in this case, we've got 30 days. Next is a cache deletion percentage. And this is the percentage of the cache size that will be freed up when you hit that limit. So in other words, if we hit 75% of our disk space, the cache, the proxy, will automatically go through and find the least used 10%, in the current case, 10% of those files, and clean them up. Now, that's so that we can bump that up to a little higher number if we don't want to be constantly cleaning up, or we can leave it at 10%. By default, most of these things can be left on their own. And the last thing to look at is the statistics persist time. This is basically is how long should the proxy and statistics kind of hang out before being written to a file. Again, not widely used except for troubleshooting. The most widely used is using this to add an additional server. So at this point, we simply say File, Save, and we can close the proxy, and we now have a newly configured proxy. So in this demonstration, we've seen how to do some of the more advanced configurations of a Team Foundation Server proxy. Team Foundation Server supports a lot of different version control options, things that you can set, things that you can require. Let's take a look at some of those things and explain when you might want to use each of them. First, we're going to find them in the Settings area. Let's click on Settings, and you'll notice that we can configure them for both the team project and the team project collection. Let's start at the team project level. These are the things that you can configure at each project independently. Now, the first is the checkout settings, and there are two primary ones: enable multiple checkout and enable get latest on checkout. This is the default you see before you. Enable multiple checkout means that multiple people can check out the same file and edit the same file at the same time. And then when they check in, if there's a conflict, it will simply require a merge. Now, conflicting changes are reconciled before check-in. That's an important part of that. The next is enable get latest on checkout. And basically, that's when you check something out, it automatically does a get latest. Now, these are defaults for a reason. I don't like enable get latest on checkout for a couple of reasons. Let's say that you have foo and you have bar, two files that are editing, and there's a dependency between them. So there's an upgraded version of both. But you double-click bar in the editor. What happens is you open up bar, it gets the latest, and you push F5 and everything breaks because you didn't get the latest of foo. So I really think that you shouldn't necessarily do enable get latest on checkout, but it is an option for those cases where it's appropriate. Enable multiple checkout. I think that is a fantastic idea. That lets people work without locking things. If you remember from Visual Source Safe long ago, it locked files, so only one person could be editing. You didn't have to merge, but caused some conflict. Now let's take a look at check-in notes. We'll come back to policies in a moment. And in check-in notes, we can add some specific notes. And basically, this note could be something like hours completed, something like that. And you can require it on check-ins. And if you do that, when you add that, anytime someone does a check-in, they have to go out and fill out this little portion where it says hours completed. You could also make it not required if you wanted. And you can do any of these notes that you want as well. And lastly, at the team project level, we have check-in policies. And there's numerous check-in policies that you can apply. Now, I'm going to click Add here to add a check-in policy. But a lot of the interesting check-in policies are in the Team Foundation Server Power Tools. I highly recommend that you download and configure the Power Tools. Because they're not part of the product, I didn't put them in here, but I really recommend that you use those. I think they are basically should be required. So the Power Tools add more onto this, like a work items query policy. So for instance, the work items one, it requires that you do an association with a work item before you can check in, but it doesn't care what work item. A work item query policy says that you must associate this check-in with a work item that is satisfied by a query. So for instance, you may want everyone to check in and associate with the task that they're working on. So you could say it must be a task and it must be open, maybe, or active task. So you can do those sorts of things. Others, we can require a change set policy. You must have a comment to check in. Now, the thing about check-in policies is they can be overridden. It pops up a little thing that says, hey, you haven't met this change set policy. Would you like to override it? And if the answer is yes, you do need to enter some text, the reason you're overriding it. And then that gets stored. And some people sign up for events that send them a notification for when people have overridden those policies and why they've done so. So we've got things at that level. And then we can go to source control at the team project collection level. And here's where we have things like file types and workspace settings. So file types leaves us with a massive number of different types of files. So we have VB files, JSharp files, you name it. And you may have your own types of files and whether or not you want to allow people to manipulate those or merge those. So let's add an example. This could be Python files. And the file extensions here are basically Py. Now we want to enable file merging and multiple checkout. Why do we want to do that? Because Python files are text and very easy to manipulate. But we might add a different type of file. And maybe this is it's a VHD. And it's a .vhd extension. This would be checking in an entire virtual image from Hyper-V. Now, we would not want to enable file merging for that. And the reason you wouldn't enable file merging is we don't have any merging tools that can merge VHDs, at least not to my knowledge. So that's why you would set those particular types of things up. Now, workspace settings are a way to configure across the board, across the TPC, Team Project Collection, what the default workspaces should be. The default workspace is local. And that's really recommended for most development. However, you could set it for server if you wanted to be compatible with older versions of Team Foundation Server, for example. You kind of liked that workflow. One other thing you can do is in the server workspaces, this is a new addition, you can enable asynchronous checkout. But if you do that and you have a server version, you really lose some of the power of the server workspaces. So you can't do checkout locks and those sorts of things. So probably stick with local in most cases by default. But if you have a need, this is where you would make those changes. So in this module, we've just talked about the source control settings and the things you can do right here to configure the way you interact with version control. Once you've installed TFS, you're going to want to set up and configure backup, just in case you need a backup and restore. Now, with the introduction of TFS 2013, that's been included as part of the Team Foundation Server Administration Console. Don't forget, however, that in addition to backing up the SQL databases, you should be taking a backup of the SQL Server encryption key as well for reporting services. And the purpose of that is so that you don't lose any subscriptions that people have signed into, and we have the keys cached for data access to the reporting databases. So let's go and back up SQL Server. First, we run into the Team Foundation Server Administration Console. From the Team Foundation Server Administration Console, we want to make sure we're on Scheduled Backups. Now, this is a new tab that's been added in 2013. Prior to this, in TFS 2012, you needed to manually configure the backups or install the Power Tools. The Tfs Power Tools also provided similar functionality, but that's been rolled into the base product. There's a couple things we can do from this tab. We can create scheduled backups, or we can restore databases. So if we've had a catastrophe, we can come back and restore our databases. Now, TFS is extraordinarily stable. And in my 9 years of working heavily with TFS, I've only seen very few instances where TFS has needed to be recovered. And in all of those instances, it's been human error that has caused the problem that's forced us to do the restore. So let's go in and create some scheduled backups, because even if it's rare, you want to be sure you're not going to lose that data. Now, we need to provide a couple things. The first is the network path that we're going to back this up on. You can't put a C drive in here or something like that. This needs to be a network path. So you need to browse out to wherever it is and establish that network path. I'm going out to our network and locating the TFS backups directory, and that's where I'll be putting the backups. Now make sure this is off of your base computer. You want this somewhere else on the network. Once we've done that, we need to specify our backup retention days, and there's an advanced tab. Now there's not much in the advanced tab. It's simply what type of file extensions do we want to use. I would just leave the default unless there's a strong reason not to. I'm going to keep our backups for 30 days and click Next. Now, a couple other items we need to choose. Do we want to include the reporting databases as part of our backup schedule? You don't need to have them to do a full recovery. However, there may be a few things in those databases, structures you've created, potentially you've uploaded new reports. So, your call, but you can select that to include those in the backup schedule. Once you've done that, I mentioned that you need to back up your encryption key as well. We can go ahead and do that. Right now, we can't use our SQL Reporting Services encryption key because we don't yet have one. We haven't created one. So let's create that encryption key and provide our master password for that and click Next. Next, it says, would you like to include all of the Sharepoint databases as well? And we might say yes. Let's include those Sharepoint databases. We're going to point out to our SQL server, list the available databases, and you'll see it automatically picks out the Sharepoint databases. We're going to back up Sharepoint as well. Let's click Next.
And then, do we want to schedule alerts? Now, we can send an email to the TFS administrators if a backup job fails. I think that's an excellent approach. First, however, we're going to need to configure SMTP, which we haven't yet done. So we'll skip over this, and don't forget to come back after you've enabled SMTP and enable these, however. And now we get to the meat of it, which is setting up the schedules. Now, for most people, nightly full backups is an awesome approach. Just every single night, you get a full backup of all of the databases, and it stores, in our case, 30 of those. You can also say that we want to only do manual backups. I don't recommend this approach. And lastly, you can create a custom schedule. Now, custom schedules are more useful if you have a fairly large TFS implementation and you've got a lot of people using it, and potentially you couldn't suffer an entire day of lost data. So in this case, we're going to take a full backup schedule every Sunday at 2 a.m. We're going to take a differential backup the rest of the week, also at 2 a.m. So this is very similar to like a nightly full backup in that we're getting that full backup every day. We're having all of our data available. But the kicker here is we're going to do a transactional backup every 15 minutes. That means we'd never lose more than 15 minutes of data. So we can schedule any of these. I have a relatively small implementation of TFS, maybe 50 people in this example, so I might go to nightly full backups and leave it there. Next, you'll click the next button, verify all of the details, click next, and it'll run through some readiness checks. Basically, can it write to the databases? Is everything okay? Or can it write to the drop location? Once the readiness checks have run, you can configure. And at this point, we have a success. Our configuration is completed successfully. We can click next, view any detailed information before we leave, and we're ready to go. Now, one is there's a detailed result here that says you should initiate a new full database backup now from the scheduled backup nodes. We can now go back in and manually trigger a backup. Otherwise, we're going to have to wait till 2 a.m. in the morning to trigger that first backup. Again, totally up to you whether you want to do that or not, or simply wait till 2 a.m. and have that backup automatically run. So to conclude, backups are now in 2013 very easy to set up and configure. Highly recommend you use this wizard, get it set up for backup, and make sure that your stuff is all secure, that you don't lose any data.
Once SharePoint's been installed, we'll go ahead and configure SharePoint to support TFS. To do that, we'll open up Internet Explorer and we'll browse to the administration console. And that is currently at the server name :17012. That's the port we gave it. And that'll fire up the central administration console. From here, we need to create a new web application. So let's go to Manage Web Applications. And this allows us to see what we currently have. Now, we only have one SharePoint web application, which is this central administration console. We need to create a new one that we can use to interact with Team Foundation Server and just upload a bunch of other things. Let's go here, and we can use the existing IIS website, the default website, or we can create a new one. We'll just use the existing default website. There's port 80 is specified. We're going to want to use port 80. A path is available. Should we allow anonymous? We want enable Windows authentication. Basically, we're going to be leaving all of the defaults available. One thing I want to note, we are going to create a new application pool that's going to run under our SharePoint service. So let's go ahead and do that. And we do need to verify that the database server is pointing to the correct database server. Now, it should already be doing so. And we're going to use Windows authentication. And lastly, do we want to participate in the Customer Experience Improvement Program? All of these things are defaults. Let's click OK. And it'll create the new web application for us. Once the application's been created, we can click OK. And now we can see that the default website has been created, sitting on port 80. That'll be necessary for TFS to have a website that it can access and manage. Work items in TFS can be very powerful. There can be some fairly substantial relationships between those work items that can cause a lot of maybe confusion for some people, but also a massive amount of power and expressiveness. Let's take a look at what I mean. Let's go into our example here where we have bugs and defects, and let me take a look at that user story tree. I have product backlog items that are broken into tasks. Now, if I open up, for instance, any old task here, and I pull it open, I can see that there's some links. And if I go to the links tab, it's going to show me that I have a parent, this product backlog item. I can open up the parent, and if I go to the links of the parent, I can see that it has 3 child tasks. You can also use those links to create very specific things like this. Here's my tasks. Here's my child tasks. And if I go in here to create a new task, the link type is child, and it can't be anything but. But let's go in and maybe make a more expressive one. We can go to Links tab, and this allows me to do any of the linking. And I'm going to create a new something that impacts this product backlog item. And rather than child, we can take something like tested by or tests. So for example, if I say tested by, and we have a product here, or sorry, not a task, but we have a test case. Let's drop in a new test case. This test case could be ensure reports are awesome. Yeah, whatever our test case is, right? So we would then say that the product backlog item is tested by this new test case. So we can go ahead and save that, and then we have that relationship between the two. Here's our test case. If I look at the links from the test case, you'll see it tests this product backlog item. Now, these are very powerful things, these linkages, but we may need to customize these linkages because we want to attach things in different ways. So potentially you have a bug, and maybe you have a task that fixes the bug or is fixed by some task. That's probably a serious stretch, but it's something that we could definitely do. So let's go ahead and save this new test case. So we have that kind of example there. And let's go back out and once again go clear to the command line and show what we can do. Let me make sure I've got this nice and clean. So here we are. If we take a look at the directory structure, we have some categories work that we've done, but we're going to use wit-admin again, but this time we're going to export the link type. And you'll see when we export link type, we have a collection that we pass in. We want to pass the link type that we want to be exported and the file name. Now, we kind of have to know the link type if we're going to export it. Luckily, if we leave off the WAC-N, then we can get a whole collection of these things, and we can see what exists inside of Team Foundation Server. So let's do that. Let's do a wit-admin, export link type. Once again, we enter all of our data. And we've now exported the link types.xml. Let's take a look at what those look like. And you can see all of the various link types that we have available. Now notice when we exported them, we didn't export them for a project. Instead, we exported them for the entire collection. That's because links span the entire collection. And we can see the various types, and we've got some pretty neat ones here. We've got ones like a test case shared parameter is referenced by and references a test case. And we have tested by and tests. That's a dependency topology. So tests and tested by, there's a dependency. We see this tree relationship, and that's kind of a hierarchy, a link type of a hierarchy, which is a child and parent relationship. And then we have kind of just a related link type here. And that related is forward and reverse name. They're just related to one another. So now if we wanted to add our own link types, we can go ahead and make those changes as well. So let's simply go in and add this next link type. I've got one right here available and ready to go. Let's talk it through. This is the link type skillsoft.fixedBy. The forward name is fixes, the reverse name is fixedBy, and there's a dependency between these two items. So let's save that link types, and then let's go in and make that change again. Let me clear this off a little bit, give us a nice clean working space. And let's go back to our export the link types, and we're going to import those link types. Simply hit enter. The link types are imported successfully. Let's go back to Visual Studio, do a refresh to make sure everything's nice and clean, and then let's go find our defect. Defect 10, and in defect 10 we can go to links and create a new link, and one of the things we now have is fixed by. So link type is fixed by, or fixes is fixed by. So we can create a task that fixes this defect. Do this to fix defect. Whatever it is. You get the idea. We've created this brand new link type between these two and established that relationship. And that's how you deal with link types. You can have a very complex and powerful topology with Team Foundation Server. One of the things that you may find yourself doing is placing things in allowed values that really don't belong being edited inside of a work item type. Instead, we want to store that somewhere else and potentially span across the entire server. For instance, if we go into Visual Studio and look at the defect that we created, we have this customer dropdown, and it was Acme Corp, Myco, or Yourco. And those three companies were basically hard-coded inside of that defect. Now, that's not always the best place to put it. Instead, we'd rather things were manipulated somewhere else outside of the work item type itself. Let's see how that's done. To do so, I'm going to go back to our command line. Now, I'm in the type definitions right now because I've got this defect that I want to pull up. If we look at the directory here, we'll see that defect that we have, and we're going to make some changes there. But before I make that change to the defect, I'm going to export the entire global list. So let's clean up a bit and do the widadmin export global list. And you can see that this exports all of the global lists defined on the server. Actually, this is in the team project collection, basically. So we're going to take all of these global things and pull them down locally so we can make some changes. Let's go ahead and do so. We're going to go back into our collection and pull it down. We'll call it globallist.xml. And then we can open up that global list. And you'll see there's not much in the global list right now. In fact, frankly, it's empty. So we need to go put stuff into that global list. Now, the first thing we have to do is we need to get rid of this and this closing brace here, and let's make sure that we close this appropriately down below. I'm going to give us a little bit of room to paste some stuff in or to work. And we'll close that global list. Now we're going to enter in our own data for this global list. Now, chances are when you've exported it, you see a lot more in here than just this blank empty one. If you've been using it for a while, you have automated builds and whatnot that start to build up inside of these global lists. Okay, we're going to go in, give ourselves a couple spaces, and create a global list type. Name equals, let's call it, we can call it just plain old customers. This might be all of our customers. And within this global list, make Make sure we close it. Within this global list, we're going to have a few list items. And we're going to play value equals, let's do Myco again, or we did, what did we did? We had Acme Corp. We'll enter in that same list, plus add one more, so let's get 4 in here. Acme Corp, Myco, Yorco, and other co, just for lack of anything better. Let's save this, and we're going to import this global list now so we can reference it. To import it, let's take the same thing that we just did, but rather than export our global list, we're going to import the global list. Once again, it's easiest to just scroll all the way back and replace export with import. Missing an end tag, we have global lists. Oh, yep, a misspelling. Make sure we catch those. Let's go back and reopen it. See, on this, we closed it with global list. We needed to close it with global lists to make sure those match. So let's go back and run that one more time. I love that it gives you these nice warnings. The global list was successfully imported. Now we actually have to go and use that global list. So to use that global list, let's fire up Notepad and bring that defect back in. And instead of our field being hard-coded, let's get rid of these allowed values that are in here, and we're going to replace it with a global list name equals customers. And I'm pretty sure we use the plural there. Now the problem is we also need to do one thing in this allowed values, which is expand items equals true. And that lets it know that we can take the customer list and expand those items out. Let's save it, go back in, and now we need to import that work item type definition. So we'll bring it back in, and with admin, we're going to put this into our reporting project again. And it's going to be our defect.xml. Got a problem? Name cannot begin with that character. Let's go find out where our problem lies. Go back in, and sure enough, I love that it gives us, again, this correction. Global list, name equals customers. Let's save that. We forgot to close out that bracket. And import once again. Okay, the work item type is completed. Let's go check out and see what we have. We're going to go back into Visual Studio. From within Visual Studio, we'll refresh our defect. I'm going to reopen again. You often don't have to reopen, but I normally do. And notice this customer now. We have Acme Corp, Myco, Other Co, which we added, and Yorco. So in this case, we've changed our hard-coded values to point to a global list. And we can export that global list and re-import that global list at any time. And that's a very powerful way to allow more changes that cross or lists of things or changes that span across your entire team project collection rather than being specific to either a team project or, in our case, specific all the way down to a work item inside of a team project. There's a fairly substantial subset of people in your organization who need access to TFS
and need it at a deeper level than is provided by the web access. For instance, they may need to integrate with Excel, they may need to integrate with Project, but they don't have Visual Studio installed or even want Visual Studio installed. For those people, we install something called the Team Explorer, and the Team Explorer enables things like Excel integration, project integration, plus it provides a fairly complete UI that they can use to work with Team Foundation Server. So to install the Team Explorer, we can go directly to the TFS installation disk. And in addition to installing TFS Server, there's a folder called the Team Explorer. If you open up Team Explorer, there's a VS_Team Explorer installation. And we can double click that and walk through that installation. Now you'll see it looks like Visual Studio. In fact, Team Explorer really is a stripped down version of Visual Studio. So to go through the install process, we agree to the license terms, and we choose or not choose to join the Visual Studio Experience Improvement Program, and then click Install. Once the setup is completed, we can launch the Team Explorer. And once again, I'll mention it looks a lot like Visual Studio, and it sounds like, and it basically is Visual Studio. I'm not going to sign in this case. It prepares for first use, and once we're done, we're right inside of Visual Studio. You'll notice right here is the Team Explorer, and right now with the Team Explorer installed, you have what looks like Visual Studio. However, you won't be able to go in and create any code. You can't write C# or VB.NET or any of that. It really is baked in just to tie in with Team Explorer. Once you're here, use all the same knowledge that you've used with Visual Studio to interact with the Team Explorer. Additionally, don't forget that you do need to install the Team Explorer in order to light up the functionality for both Excel and Microsoft Project.
When you're creating team builds, you often come to a place where you need to diagnose a failing build. And to do that, you often rely on the build logs. So let's take a look at how we can find those build logs and what we can do with them. First, let's open up Visual Studio and go to our builds. And let's open up a log from something that we've already executed. This hello world, a successful one. We can look up here and see in the diagnostics, we can drop down and view the logs right from here. Now, before I do that, however, there's a visual indicator. This is the summary of the build, and it kind of lays out things like some warnings that we have, tests that were impacted, etc. We can change this view to a log view, and it'll show us all of the things that it did at some level of detail. It's a reasonable level of detail that's pretty decent. And most of the time, this is all you need. But if you need more, we can go to Diagnostics and view the logs, or the final logs, whichever. In this case, they bring us to the same place, the logs location. And we can open up Hello World and see that Hello World build. Let's open it up. Now take a look. We've got a lot of different things here, and this kind of gives us a layout of what's happening. We're copying every single file, shows what files are being copied. The app config is being copied. All of those sorts of things. And then that the build succeeded. We had this kind of information. It's relatively verbose, this log. But if it's not verbose enough, we can increase the verbosity of the logging, and we do that by going into Hello World, editing the build definition, and we can do it either here or for an individual build. But in the process, we're going to pass into MS Build an additional parameter. So let's go to the build under Advanced, and a parameter, it's called verbosity. And we can use several different values. Q if we just don't want any logs to be taken from that automated build. M for minimal, or we can type minimal. N for normal. D for detailed. That's basically what we're getting when we're running a normal MS build. The summary page is more like a normal, and then the log itself is detailed. But we can also make that diag, which is diagnostics, and save that. And then when we trigger our build, we'll get a diagnostic chunk of information. Let's queue it. And that's going to give us a little bit more information about our build. Now, we have a very simple build. And the difference between detailed and diagnostic is pretty limited. But let's take a look at what we have anyway. So our build just started. Let's clean up and take a look. You can see it completed, and we can go into our diagnostics and view those logs. And down here in our Hello World log, we can open it up and see this log. Now, I noted before that the detailed is pretty detailed and that the diagnostics doesn't add too much more. In our case, the diagnostics added this detailed build summary where we have kind of a timestamp about how long each node took and a little bit more details of it. But that's how you would turn on diagnostic tracing to get more information in your build logs. Creating new builds is the way we deliver software. We compile the build, we drop it out in a location, and it's such a common and important thing to do in the whole application lifecycle that it's something we really want a nice engine to help us build. And Team Foundation Server ships with something called Team Build. So as a quick introduction to Team Build, we're going to walk through a very quick demonstration of how to set up a build for a very simple app. Let's jump into Visual Studio and see what we have. We have a very simple solution. If I run the solution, it's a Hello World application. Simply pops up a form that says say hi. When I click it, it says Hello World. Again, trivial application, but it doesn't matter. The complexity of the app isn't really bound to Team Build. Team Build can build anything. Granted, there might be some moving parts that we'll need to configure, but from a conceptual standpoint, this is just as good as any other app. So let's start with our really simple app and go to Team Explorer and create an automated build for it. We're going into the Builds tab, and notice we have no build definitions, we have no favorite build definitions, we basically have nothing. So let's create a new build definition and build that application. Now we have our build infrastructure, which we've set up and configured for this Team Foundation Server implementation. Let's start. We're going to call this Hello World for lack of a better name. It's enabled. We're going to give it a trigger, and we'll talk about triggers here later in a moment. We're just going to do a manual trigger for now. Source settings, we need to say, where does it get this data? Now, it's copied the existing workspace, and there's a lot of stuff in here that we don't need. So let's make sure we go in and we delete all the Tailspin Toys stuff and all those other sorts of things that we're not going to need. What we care about is this active project, and we want to make sure that we download that active project. Next, we want to make sure that we have a place to drop that, and I've cloaked this so we don't keep getting it back and forth, but we can actually drop the output into version control. Now, there's a lot of debate here. You may not want to drop things into version control. You may instead want to put them on a file share, and we'll talk about that as well. Then the build defaults. What are we going to build? What's the build controller? We're going to use this build controller. Where do we want to drop the build? So we're going to do the build, and then we need to drop it somewhere. And we can do a couple things. We can just say this build does not copy any output anywhere. It just builds it, compiles it, and then it's done. It doesn't go drop that output somewhere. We could also copy it, the build output, to the server. So we could copy that and put it out in the server somewhere. We're going to not do anything with a drop location. That's going to be a following presentation that we'll talk about. Then the process. What do we want to do? And this is where we walk through and configure this build definition, some of the properties. And we'll walk through these in more detail later. And last, our retention policy. How long do we want to keep them around? Again, we'll be talking a lot of these things later. This is just a very simple one to show us to creating a brand new build definition. We now have our build definition, Hello World over here, and we can trigger that by right-clicking and queuing a new build. This will, on the build server, not on my local machine, but on the build server, it'll queue the latest sources and build them out. Let's hit queue. Notice build number 1 just started. We can double click it to see the build itself and see what's happening during this build. As the build progresses, you'll see it's running on an agent. We have our overall build process executing, and it's going to continue to execute, and we can watch its progress as it goes. We notice that it's running on this agent right here, right now. It's now gotten to the compile, test, and publish step, and it's running the MS build script to build it. Now, the MS build script is just the project file itself. The build succeeded. We can go down. We can see any warnings that we have. There's usually generally some warnings on just a demo app, but we can see like there was a type mismatch and some other things of what we're trying to build, but nothing that caused the build to fail, nor anything that caused any errors to be thrown. At any time, we can close this. At any time, we can go back and see some of our builds by double-clicking them, and it'll open up the build, and we can watch the build summary. We can see the history of all of our builds, and once again, we can choose to retain it indefinitely. We can retry the build, view the controller queue, lots of things we can do. Let's just open it again, and this is where we can see what happened during this build and that the build succeeded. Boom. So in this demonstration, we've walked through simply creating a brand new team build. And last thing I want to mention before we leave is this build is executing on the build server, not on the developer's machine. That's important from the perspective. You don't want to get the "it works on my machine" error. You really want to have the build running on a build machine that's kind of a canonical, clean instance and doesn't have all of the mess the developer's machine generally has.